Hello and welcome back to Something Z, and welcome to If Deku had a copy quirk part 3. Last time on the What If the USJ attack happened, with Izuku surviving the attack, with Izuku at the end of the attack having the quirks Explosion from Bakugo, Heal from Recovery Girl, Erasure from Aizawa, and he still has his force field. Okay, so now that's out of the way, let's jump into the video in 3, 2, 1. Okay, so it's been days since the attack, since UA allowed them a couple of days off to get some rest. And when school started, Aizawa came into the class with bandages wrapped around him. And when he was done with his roll call, he told the class that in 2 weeks a sports festival will take place. And hearing this, people began to question whether or not they should even have the festival, since they were just attacked. But hearing this, Aizawa told them that they need to have the festival, or they would send out a message saying that they could be stopped after one attack. And hearing this, the class calmed down. So now we skip 2 weeks, and during that time, Izuku practiced increasing his stamina and training his new quirks, since most of Izuku's quirks rely on how much energy he uses. So now we skip to the day of the festival, and when it began, Todoroki didn't challenge Izuku since he doesn't have one for all. And when it started, Ida walked into the room and he led Class 1A into the sports arena. And when all the participants were there, Midnight, who was the referee, began to tell them the rules for the first event, which was an obstacle race. And when she was done, she told them to line up at the hallway. And when everyone was lined up, Midnight began to count down. And when she got to 0, the race began. And when it did, everyone began to run through the hallway. And after some time, Todoroki began to freeze the ground under and around him, which stuck most of the racers in place. And when the ice got to Izuku put his hands to the ground and he fired an explosion, which fired him into the air, thus making him able to avoid the ice. Then Izuku began to fire explosions until he was able to get out of the hallway. And when he was out, Izuku began to run. And Izuku by this point is somewhere in the upper middle area of the group. And after some time, the group notices robots from the entrance exams. And after some time, the group comes across multiple zero-pointers. And Todoroki, seeing this, ran towards one of the robots in the front, and he ran under the robot, and he froze it in place while it was off balance. And when Todoroki ran past it, the robot fell to the ground, crushing 2 runners, with them being Kirishima and Tetsu. And seeing this, multiple runners flew/jumped over the robot, with one of them being Bakugo. And seeing this, Izuku began to fire explosions to make himself go faster. And when he got to the robot, Izuku aimed his hands down and he fired explosions, allowing him to soar over the robot. And when Izuku was clear of the bot, Izuku jumped off the bot, and he fired an explosion right under himself, which cushioned his fall. And when he landed, he began to run with his arms behind his back, and he fired explosions, which allowed him to run faster. So he's now in the front of the group, with him being in 5th place. And after some time, the group comes across a giant canyon, and when Izuku got to it, he saw Bakugo using his explosions to fire himself over the canyon. So Izuku then fired explosions to make himself land on platforms that were spread across a ravine until he gets to the other side. And by the time Izuku got to the other side, Bakugo caught up to Todoroki, and they were already starting to go across the minefield, and they were 20 feet away. And seeing this, Izuku ran to the field as fast as he could. And when he got to the field, Izuku began to fire explosions to try to catch up. But not only was he focusing on going across, Izuku wanted to get as high as he could. And when Izuku was somewhat caught up, he was 10 feet away and 25 feet into the air. And when he was at that height, Izuku stopped using his explosions, and he stared at the two using Aizawa's quirk, forcing them to stop using their quirks. And not expecting this, Bakugo, who was in the air fighting Todoroki, fell to the ground, causing him to trigger some mines. And Todoroki, who was running on ice, kept running, even though he stopped making ice, making him step on a mine. And while these two were distracted, Izuku kept going. But after Izuku stopped using Aizawa's quirk, the two were able to quickly recover and continue going. And after a couple of minutes, the three were able to get to the stadium, with Izuku getting 1st place, Todoroki getting 2nd, and Bakugo getting 3rd. And shortly after the three make it to the stadium, everyone else made it to the stadium. And after everyone arrived, all the remaining participants went to the center of the stadium, and they were told by Midnight about the 2nd phase of the festival, which was a cavalry battle. And once Midnight was done explaining the rules of the battle, she showed the amount of points everyone had, revealing Izuku had the 10 million point headband. And when that was revealed, everyone began to glare at Izuku. And shortly after this was revealed, Midnight gave the remaining participants 15 minutes to come up with their teams. And since everyone knew the amount Izuku had, they stayed clear of him. And after some time, Izuku spotted Ochako and Ida, and when he got to them, he asked if they would join him, which Ochako accepted, but Ida told him that he wanted to beat Izuku to not stay in the shadow. And when he was done saying that, Ida walked away, and he joined Team Todoroki. And after some time, Mei Hatsume and Tokoyami joined his team, and when the 15 minutes were up, the headbands were distributed. And once everyone was ready, Midnight began to count down, and when she got to 0, the cavalry battle began. And when it did, many people came for Team Izuku, but when they tried, Izuku deactivated their quirks with the help of Aizawa's quirk, allowing Team Izuku to get the headbands while staying safe from the other teams. And after some time, another team came across Team Izuku, and they ran at Team Izuku. And seeing this, Izuku disabled the quirks of the people on the bottom, so only the blonde-haired person still had their quirk. But before Izuku could react, an explosion came from the blonde person's hand, aimed directly at Izuku's face, primarily the eyes, which made Izuku stop using Aizawa's quirk, since he had to close his eyes. And while Izuku was blinded, the blonde-haired person touched Ochako's hair, and when he did, his fingertips changed, making them similar to Ochako. Ochakos. And while Izuku still had smoke in his eyes, Monoma used his new quirk to make all of Team Izuku weightless, which made it harder for Team Izuku to move. And when the team noticed this, they shouted for Izuku to tell them what to do. And when he heard this, Izuku told his team to hold on tight. Then Izuku activated the jetpack he was wearing, which he got from Hatsume, which flung the team into the air. And after a couple of seconds, Izuku was able to get his vision back. And when he was able to see again, Izuku scanned the stadium until he eventually found the person with blonde hair, and he used Aizawa's quirk to cancel out his quirk. And when he did, Monoma's fingertips went back to normal, and Team Izuku got their weight back, which made them start to fall to the ground. And in response, Izuku used his jetpack to allow the team to fall safely. And when they landed, waiting for them was Team Monoma. And when they landed, Izuku was still confused about how this guy can use both Ochako's and Bakugo's quirks. But then he remembered what All Might told him when he got accepted into UA, and how there was someone else who had the same quirk as him, named Monoma. So Izuku then told his team that their best option was to run, because he still had a burning sensation in his eyes, which made it harder for him to use Aizawa's quirk, and if they made contact with Monoma, it could be a problem. But before they could escape, Team Todoroki appeared, and Todoroki began to fire out ice attacks, which Izuku was able to stop with the help of his explosions. And while Todoroki was firing ice attacks, Monoma and his team ran away, since they knew it would be better if they went for different opponents. And after some time avoiding ice attacks, Ito told his team to hold on tight, and when Team Todoroki did, Ito began to fire up his engines. And when he was ready, Ito used his new speed to get Team Todoroki in front of Team Izuku, and before they were able to react, Todoroki was able to get the 10 million point headband. And seeing this, Team Izuku knew that they needed to get the headband back, since even though they were getting headbands through the entire event, they didn't have enough points to pass. So Team Izuku then began to run at Team Todoroki, and while they were running, Todoroki fired ice attack after ice attack. And after some time, Izuku was able to get to Team Todoroki, and when Izuku got to Todoroki, he went to grab the 10 million point headband, and when he went to reach out for Todoroki, Todoroki went to swat Izuku's hand away, but while he was moving his arm, he used his fire side. And seeing this, Todoroki stopped moving for a second, and he turned off his fire, but not before Izuku was able to notice. And with the time Todoroki gave him, Izuku was able to grab the headband, and when he did, he wrapped it around his neck and he pointed his hands toward Team Todoroki, and he then fired an explosion to fling the four of them away. And when they landed, Izuku looked at the headband to make sure it was secured on his neck. But when Izuku looked at the headband, he knows that it wasn't actually the 10 million point headband, and even with his new headband, they still didn't have enough points to pass. So Team Izuku then ran at Team Todoroki as fast as they could, with only a couple of seconds left before it ended, and they got close to Team Todoroki, but before Izuku was able to get to any of Todoroki's headbands, the time ended. And when they did, Izuku began to apologize for not getting them enough points. But while he was apologizing, Tokoyami told him to look at the leaderboard, and when he did, he saw that they had somehow got enough points to pass. And when Izuku looked back, he saw Tokoyami holding onto a new headband he just got off of Todoroki while he wasn't paying attention. And after this, the students had a break. And because Izuku doesn't have one for all, Todoroki doesn't have his conversation with Izuku, so now he skipped to when lunch was over. And when it was, all the first years met back at the center of the stadium. And there, Midnight told everyone the next phase of the festival, which were 1v1s. And after the names of the matchups were revealed, Ojiro and someone from Class 1B forfeited, since they both felt like they didn't deserve it. And after they changed the names, the students in the first match went to the prep room to prepare themselves for the match, which were Izuku and Shinso, while the rest of the first years went to the bleachers to watch the match. And while Izuku was preparing, Ojiro walked into the room and he began to tell Izuku about Shinso, and what his quirk seems to be. And by the time Ojiro was done, the match was about to begin. So Izuku then began to walk to the stadium while Ojiro went to the bleachers. And when both Shinso and Izuku got to the battle arena in the stadium, Midnight began to count, and when she got to 0, the match began. And when it did, Izuku closed his mouth and he began to walk towards Shinso. And while he was walking, Shinso began to berate Izuku, telling him he will only be a sidekick, and that he's not strong on his own, and how Ojiro is worthless. And even though Izuku wanted to say something, Izuku kept his mouth closed. And when Izuku got to Shinso, the two began to do hand-to-hand combat, since Izuku wanted to keep his energy for the next matches. And after some time, Izuku was able to grab Shinso's arm and toss him out of the arena, making Izuku the winner of the match. And after the match, Izuku went to Recovery Girl's office to get healed. And while he was walking to the bleachers, Izuku walked into Endeavor, who told Izuku that he has potential to be a challenge for Todoroki, and he told Izuku to make Todoroki go all out and use his fire side. And hearing this, Izuku told Endeavor that Todoroki wasn't him. Then he patted Endeavor on the shoulder, copying his quirk. In exchange, he got rid of Erasure, and the reason he did this is because he knew he probably needed more firepower in order to beat Todoroki, and his eyes were a bit weak from the blast Monoma fired at him. And realizing what Izuku did, Endeavor was about to shout at Izuku, but before he could, Izuku ran away. So now he skipped to when the match was about to begin, and when it did, Izuku began to fight by running head-on towards Todoroki, and in response, Todoroki fired an ice attack, which was taller than Izuku. And seeing this, Izuku fired an explosion towards the ground, which flung him over the ice, and this kept going on, with Todoroki using ice attacks to hopefully keep Izuku back, while Izuku used his explosions to avoid attacks. And eventually, Izuku was able to get to Todoroki, and when he got close, Izuku began to increase his temperature, beginning to light his hair on fire without actually burning it. Then while Todoroki was confused, Izuku shot out a wave of flames to try to to burn Todoroki, but before the flames hit Todoroki, Todoroki made an ice wall, which melted but blocked the attack. So the two then began to fight using fire and ice, and after a couple of minutes, Izuku noticed ice starting to form on the side of Todoroki, and he was beginning to shiver. And seeing this, Izuku realized the weakness to Todoroki's quirk. And seeing this, Izuku asked Todoroki why is he not using his fire side. And hearing this, Todoroki began to put things together in his mind, and he asked if he was working with his dad to make sure he uses it. And hearing this, Izuku denied, and the two began to go back and forth arguing. And after some time, Izuku shouted that it's your power, not his. And hearing this, Todoroki began to reflect on everything, and after a couple of seconds, he began to ignite his fire side, which melted the ice that was formed on him. And seeing this, Izuku began to prepare himself, and when they were both ready, they began to fire their final attacks. So Todoroki fired the biggest ice attack he could fire, which was too big for Izuku to dodge or avoid. So Izuku decided to go all out with his fire. So he heated himself as hot as he could, then he fired a fire attack, which melted the ice somewhat, and it became a stalemate with Todoroki losing energy, but he used his fire side to keep his temperature equal, while Izuku, however, began to give in to his fire quirk. So he began to feel the drawback of the heat, and he was starting to lose power. And after a minute, Izuku caved in, so he stopped using his fire quirk. And when Izuku stopped shooting out flames, the ice Todoroki shot hit Izuku head on, which froze Izuku in place. And seeing this, Midnight declared Todoroki as the winner. And after the fight, Izuku was taken to Recovery Girl's office to get healed. And while Izuku was getting healed, the rest of the matches took place, with the results being the same. So now we skip to when Class 1A was back into their classroom, after the festival was over. And when Aizawa was sure everyone was back, he announced that they will have the next 2 days off to relax. So now we skip to when the 2 days were over. And when it began, Aizawa showed the results of the sports festival, and how many offers each student got for the hero work studies, with Bakugo and Todoroki getting the highest amount of offers, with Izuku getting the third highest amount of offers since he proved how good his quirk is, and how good he is at using it. And before they were able to decide what pro hero / agents they wanted to join, Midnight walked into the room, and she told them that they will be coming up with hero names. And after some time, Izuku decided on what name he wanted to call himself, which was the Imitation Hero, Emulator. And after they came up with their hero names, Class 1A began to choose what pro agents they wanted to take for the work studies. And after a couple of hours, Izuku was able to decide on which agency he wanted to join, which was the pro hero Endeavor, since he was the highest ranked hero that gave him an offer. And Endeavor gave Izuku an offer since Izuku helped Todoroki use his fire side, and he thinks it would be good if he got to know Izuku better, since he could be a good partner for Todoroki. So now we skip to when it was time for the internships. So Class 1A was at the train station about to split up, and when Ida was ready, he began to walk away. And seeing this, Izuku and Ochako ran to Ida, and they told him that they were his friends, and because of that, he could tell them anything. And hearing this, Ida nodded his head, and he began to walk to his train again. So now we skip a couple of hours, and Izuku and Todoroki were at Endeavor's agency, and when they were done setting up their rooms, they went to the training area, and they began to train, with Todoroki fighting Izuku using his fire side, while Izuku was using Endeavor's quirk, so Todoroki could get better at using his fire side. And after a couple of hours of this, Izuku set up a force field around himself, and when he was ready, Todoroki began to fire a wave of flames at the field, so he could practice increasing the damage and the heat of his flames, while Izuku could practice taking damage. And this kept going on for a couple of days, with Izuku and Todoroki sparring each other. And when it was the third day, Endeavor told Izuku and Todoroki that they will be going to host 2 patrol, because lately there has been a villain attacking and killing pro heroes. And when they were ready, they went to the train. And when they began to patrol, they noticed a fire at the center of the city, so they ran to where the fire was. And when they did, they saw pro heroes fighting a group of Nomus. And when Izuku and Todoroki were escorting civilians out of the way, Izuku heard the pro hero Manuel shout for Ida. And hearing this, Izuku began to think about what Ida was possibly thinking. And eventually, after a couple of seconds, he realized that Ida was probably after the hero killer. So Izuku then ran to Todoroki and told him what he believed. And hearing this, Todoroki nodded, and the two ran to Endeavor, and they told him that they needed to go to help someone they knew. And after they were done telling him this, they began to run off. And while they were running away, they shouted that he should tell the other pro heroes to scout the area when they were done. So the two then split up, and they began to run through all the alleyways they could, since they believed that Stain would attack in the shadows. And after some time, Izuku found Stain standing above Ida about to stab him, with the pro hero native next to him, too injured to move. And before Stain could stab Ida, Izuku shot out a wave of flames aimed at Stain. And right before it hit, Stain jumped over the flames, and he backed away from Ida. And when Stain was a good distance away, Izuku pulled out his phone and he sent a ping to Todoroki. And when he was done with that, Izuku put his phone away, and the two began to fight, with Stain trying to slash at Izuku, and whenever Stain got too close, Izuku would use Endeavor's flames to push him back and attack. But after a couple of minutes, Izuku began to give in to the heat, and he began to get sluggish. And using this to his advantage, Stain was able to slash Izuku's cheek with a knife, and he licked the blood on the blade, which paralyzed Izuku. And when Izuku hit the floor, Stain told Izuku that he wouldn't kill him, since he just showed that he is a true hero. Then he walked over to Ida and he went to stab him again. But before the blade could hit, another wave of flames came towards Stain again, which he jumped over. And when the group was able to see where the flame came from, they saw Todoroki, who then began to fight Stain, with Todoroki using his fire and ice to block some of Stain's attacks. And whenever he got injured, he used either side to cover the wound, making it harder for Stain to get his blood. And after a couple of minutes, Izuku was able to get control of his body back, and when he got back up, he kissed his arm, which healed up all of his cuts. And after that, him and Todoroki began to fight Stain, with Izuku using both his flames and explosions to attack Stain. But even though the two were fighting Stain together, they were still having a hard time. And after a couple more minutes, Ida was able to gain control of his body again. And with the help of Ida, the three were able to stop Stain was the final attack, knocking out Stain. And when Stain was knocked out, the three tied him up with a rope they found in the area. Then they brought him to a nearby road while carrying the injured native, so they could be seen. And after a couple of minutes, they were spotted by pro heroes who were told to scout the area to look for them by Endeavor. And after they were spotted, the police and hospital were called for the group. But before any of them could arrive, a Nomu appeared and it grabbed Izuku up. Then it began to fly away. And Izuku was positioned in a way so he couldn't shoot out anything to attack. And before Izuku could find a way out, Stain cut out of the rope, and he leapt onto the Nomu and he stabbed the Nomu in the head, killing it. And when the Nomu landed, Stain stood up, and no one made a move since they could feel his bloodlust, and they got paralyzed with fear. And while they were paralyzed, Stain began to talk about what a real hero is. And after a minute, Stain stopped talking, and hearing this, a pro hero walked over to Stain. And when they did, they saw that he was knocked out because a broken rib pierced one of his lungs. And a couple hours later, Stain was taken to the police while Native, Ida, Todoroki, and Izuku were taken to the hospital to get healed, because Izuku was too tired to even use the healing quirk Recovery Girl gave him. And that's where I'm going to leave the what if. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope to see you next time on Something Z.